France, November 1944. Mud-swallowed tank tracks. Rain hammered steel. The air stank of fuel, blood, and fear. The German army, cornered, desperate, dying, was more dangerous than ever. Their armored divisions still roamed the countryside like wounded animals with teeth. Into that storm rolled a tank with a Black Panther. Painted on its hull, inside the turret, sat a crew of men who had been told their entire lives that they weren't fit to fight, not smart enough for armor, not disciplined enough for tanks, not equal enough to wear the uniform of those who commanded them. The U.S. Army didn't want them. Racism tried to confine them. History nearly erased them, but war has a way of revealing truth. The 761st Tank Battalion, later called the Black Panthers, were about to prove that courage has no color. When General George S. Patton inspected them, his words were blunt. "I don't care what color you are. Go out there and kill those Germans." Thunder rolled. Engines growled. Hatches slammed shut. The Panthers surged forward, toward fire, toward destiny, toward a place in history that no one wanted to give them. They would take it anyway. Before the tanks rolled into Europe, before the name Black Panthers meant anything, the story began in a country at war with itself, a nation fighting Hitler's racism abroad while enforcing segregation at home. In 1941, when America entered World War II, the U.S. Army was segregated by law. Black soldiers could wear the uniform, but only in limited roles. Loading ammunition, driving trucks, cooking for officers, digging latrines. They could fight and die, but not command, not lead, and certainly not drive a tank worth millions of dollars. The official belief from the Army War College, written down as policy, stated, "Black soldiers lack the mental capacity to operate complex machinery." That sentence shaped everything. It meant the Armored Corps, the pride of the American military, was for white soldiers only. The Sherman tank was seen as a thinking weapon. You needed coordination, training, engineering skill, quick decisions under fire. In the eyes of the U.S. military hierarchy, white soldiers strategized, black soldiers served. So when young black men volunteered to fight, the answer was almost always the same. No. We already have a job for you. But across America, from Chicago factories to Louisiana farms, there were young men who refused to accept that answer. They didn't want to cook meals for other soldiers. They didn't want to sit in the back. They didn't want to watch history pass by while others fought. They wanted tanks. One of those men was Sergeant Reuben Rivers. He grew up in Oklahoma, in a world where opportunity was rationed. He was strong, fearless, and stubborn. He could read terrain like others read newspapers. He didn't ask for anyone's permission to be brave. He simply lived that way. In 1942, he walked into a recruiting office and told the clerk, "I'm here for armor." The clerk laughed. "You're in the wrong line." Reuben didn't move, and when more men like him showed up, refusing to take no for an answer, something extraordinary happened. The U.S. Army relented. They created a new battalion, experimental, segregated, watched closely, to test whether black soldiers could handle tanks. Its name, 761st Tank Battalion. It was activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The men chosen were not ordinary recruits. They were college athletes, mechanics, welders, engineers, men with experience working with engines or machinery, men with ambition. The Army wanted to prove itself right. It wanted this new battalion to fail. If the 761st messed up, the segregationists in Washington could point to them and say, "See, we told you." So the Army picked the very best, and then they tried to break them. Training was constant humiliation. White officers barked insults, questioned their intelligence, mocked their uniforms, and reminded them, every day, that they were not welcome. If a white tank crew made a mistake, it was called training. If a black crew made a mistake, it was called proof. The men of the 761st understood that they weren't just training to operate a tank. They were training to shatter a myth. They drilled harder than any other unit. They studied engines, turret hydraulics, ballistics, fuel distribution, and map reading. They cleaned tanks until they could see their reflections on the armor plating. They had something no other battalion had. Something to prove. At Camp Hood, Texas, they met the man who would shape their future and test their resolve to the breaking point. General George S. Patton. He inspected them in the brutal Texas heat. Tanks lined up, men in perfect formation, uniforms crisp, eyes forward. Patton walked slowly, his steel helmet gleaming. His ivory-handled pistols like an extension of his personality. He considered black soldiers inferior. He didn't want them, But he needed tanks and crews badly. He stopped in front of a Panther tank. He looked at the crew. Then he told the battalion, "I don't care what color you are. I only care that you can fight." He leaned close to one of the men, stared directly into his eyes and growled, "And you'd better fight." Patton didn't say it with encouragement. He said it as a challenge, and every man in the 761st took it personally. They began to outperform other tank battalions. Their gunnery tests were precise. Their maneuvers were flawless. They drove faster, shot straighter, and repaired engines faster than white units that had months of extra training. But despite being ready for combat, they sat, waiting. While white tank battalions shipped to Europe, the 761st was kept in the States, months, then years, not because they weren't prepared, but because the Army wasn't ready to admit they were wrong. The men listened to the radio. They heard the casualty reports. They heard about Normandy, about tanks burning in hedgerows, about American armor struggling against German Panthers and Tigers. They didn't want to wait anymore. Tank Commander Paul Bates said it best in a letter to his mother. "We are ready to fight Hitler. We just need the chance." That chance finally came in October 1944. The U.S. Third Army, Patton's army, was bleeding tanks. The German counterattack was fierce. Fuel was running low, ammo was rationed, and armored reinforcements were scarce. Reports said the Germans were preparing new offensives along the Siegfried Line. Patton radioed headquarters. "Send me tanks." Headquarters replied, "We have 1 battalion available." "They're black." Patton paused. He remembered their faces, their discipline, their precision. He sent one sentence back. "Send them." On October 28, 1944, after more than 2 years of waiting, the order finally arrived. The 761st Tank Battalion was shipping out. The men climbed aboard transport ships in complete silence. Their tanks, Shermans, marked with the Panther, were already loaded in the lower decks. Each man carried his duffel bag and 2 heavy questions. Would they prove they belonged? And would America ever acknowledge them? At night, on the cold water of the Atlantic, the men stayed together in tight groups, not because they were afraid of submarines, but because they were used to being isolated, used to being separated from others, used to being told they didn't matter. But soon, they would. When they reached France, a journal entry from a tank gunner reads, "We stepped onto land that would remember us more than our own country did." They landed near Omaha Beach, on ground where thousands of Americans had already died. White units marched past them, staring at the black tankers in disbelief. Some pointed, some laughed, some simply shook their heads. "Your tankers? Where did they get these guys? Segregated tanks? You've got to be kidding." The Black Panthers didn't react. They weren't there to win approval. They were there to win the war. On November 7, 1944, Patton gathered the battalion. The wind was cold. The sky was gray. The ground smelled of wet metal and diesel fuel. The men stood at attention, mud soaking into their boots. Patton spoke the words that would define their legacy. "You are the first Negro tankers to fight in the American Army." He paused. "I don't care what color you are. I care how you fight." He leaned forward. "And you will fight." With those words, the battalion rolled into the line. Their first mission was not reconnaissance, not support, not escort. Patton threw them directly at the enemy's strongest point, a German panzer division. The Panthers looked at each other. No fear, no excuses. They sealed the hatches, engines roared, the ground shook. The 761st Tank Battalion drove into combat with a single, unofficial motto: "Come out fighting." And they did. Europe, 1944. By now, rumors were spreading among frontline units. An all-black tank battalion was inbound. To many white soldiers, it didn't make sense. They had grown up in a country that told them black men were unfit to command, unfit to lead, unfit to think under pressure. Yet here they were, arriving with tanks freshly painted, engines rumbling like distant thunder. They were officially designated the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers. Motto: "Come out fighting." But their real battle began long before Europe. Inside the U.S. Army, racism was not subtle. It was policy. Black soldiers were usually assigned to labor units, digging ditches, unloading ships, moving supplies. The idea of letting them operate tanks, the most expensive, most technologically complex weapon system of the ground war, was outrageous to Army leadership. Some generals refused outright. Even General George S. Patton, himself known for brutality and bluntness, resisted. When reviewing the battalion for deployment, he told them, "I don't care what color you are tankers." But before those words came, he also said, "I don't want them. They don't have the guts for combat." The room fell silent. Patton wasn't giving them inspiration. He was giving them a challenge, almost daring them to prove him wrong, and they would. Training was brutal. At Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, then later at Camp Hood in Texas, the Black Panthers trained under extreme pressure. They were given outdated tanks, fewer supplies, and were constantly told they were under evaluation. A polite military phrase meaning, "We're looking for a reason to cancel you." White officers were rotated in and out, many treating the battalion as a career punishment. Some openly told the men, "You will never see combat." But the Panthers kept training. They perfected firing drills. They studied terrain. They trained at night when others slept. They turned their tanks into an extension of themselves. Then, fate intervened. In the winter of 1944, Hitler launched his last major gamble, a surprise attack in Belgium designed to break the Allied lines. It would be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The U.S. Army was desperate. They were outnumbered. They were freezing. They needed tank reinforcements. Now, suddenly, the Army remembered the unit that had been waiting, ignored and underestimated for years. A message came down. Send in the Black Panthers. The 761st packed their gear and rolled toward frontline combat, not as laborers, not as support, but as tankers. They had waited years for this moment, and they were ready. What they didn't know. Their first battle would be one of the fiercest armored engagements of the entire war. They were heading straight into a collapsing front line, where American units were being pushed back, town by town, ridge by ridge, and in less than 48 hours, the Black Panthers would be fighting Nazi armor head-on, not just to prove themselves, but to prove an entire nation wrong. Belgium, November 1944. The Black Panthers entered combat not with ceremony, but with urgency. Snow whipped across the Ardennes forest as their M4 Sherman tanks crawled forward, engines groaning under the weight of ice. Visibility was low. The roads were clogged with refugees, wounded soldiers, and abandoned vehicles. Every mile they advanced, the gunfire grew louder. They were heading directly into chaos. On paper, their assignment was simple: relieve battered U.S. infantry positions. Hold the line. In reality, it meant driving straight toward a German armored offensive designed to tear the Allied front apart. Their first real engagement occurred near Morville-le-Vic, France. The township was surrounded by fields turned to sludge by rain and artillery, infantry pinned down, artillery running out, communication lines severed. The Germans held the high ground, the ultimate advantage in tank warfare. The Panthers' orders arrived over the radio. Move. Take Morville. No retreat. Captain David Williams, one of the rare black officers in the battalion, gathered his men. He didn't give a speech. He just said, "Mount up." As the Shermans advanced, German artillery found them immediately. Shells detonated all around. Fountains of dirt, mud, and steel erupted into the air. Inside the lead tank, Gunner Corporal Herman Lawson steadied his hands over the cannon controls. A Tiger tank appeared in the distance. The Tiger was a monster. Thicker armor, bigger gun, longer firing range. A Sherman shouldn't beat one head-on. The Panther tanks kept advancing anyway. Lawson locked in, giving no sign he understood the math of the situation. Boom! The Sherman fired. A second of silence. Then, the Tiger's turret erupted in flame. Lawson whispered, almost in disbelief, "Target hit." The radio exploded with cheers. The first German tank destroyed by the 761st Tank Battalion. A kill that shouldn't have been possible. But the Panthers weren't fighting for probability. They were fighting for existence. The battalion's next major operation was in Tillet, Belgium, a small village with strategic roads leading toward the Bulge. They had a 3.1 disadvantage. For every Panther Sherman tank, the Germans had 3 armored vehicles. For every minute they delayed, American units elsewhere became more vulnerable. The hills surrounding Tillet were packed with German machine gun nests. Every approach was a field of fire. Lieutenant Jack Wood, a white officer who served with the battalion, later wrote, "Black tankers fought harder because they had more to prove. They were the best tankers I ever served with." The Panthers entered Tillet under pitch-black night. They moved without headlights, only moonlight glinting off steel. Tank treads crushed snow and broken branches. Every man inside those tanks knew Shermans could burn if hit. They nicknamed them Ronsons, like the lighter. Still, they pushed forward. Machine gun fire erupted from the tree line. Infantry from the 87th Division dove for cover, pinned down. The Panthers didn't stop. Their Shermans rotated turrets, firing high explosive rounds into the tree line. Fireballs lit up the forest. Infantry surged forward behind the tanks. Tank, infantry, tank, infantry. A rhythm of liberation. From the rear, a hidden German Panzer IV emerged. It had waited in silence, let the Shermans pass, then lined up the perfect shot. One direct hit could have set an entire squadron ablaze. Panther gunner, Wilburn smoke. Walker spun his turret without being ordered. He fired blind. Boom! The round hit the Panzer square in the engine block. Flames shot up into the trees. The infantry behind them cheered. The Panthers didn't celebrate, they advanced, because liberation wasn't the mission. Holding the line was, perhaps no man in the battalion became more feared than Private First Class William MacDonald. He was a tank driver, and he drove like the war owed him money. During combat, he maneuvered his tank so aggressively that crew members called him Black Death. Not because he was reckless, because he was unpredictable, even to the enemy. In Tillet, his tank caught a German 80mm shell directly off the front glacis plate. The tank jolted. Crew members ducked. MacDonald didn't flinch. Instead, he hit full throttle, swinging the Sherman into an unexpected reverse flank. He exposed the German gun crew's position, and his gunner took them out. Later that day, a fellow tanker said, "That man drives a tank like it's a sports car." MacDonald replied, "Guess that makes us the underdogs with horsepower." The 761st began gaining a reputation. Infantry units requested them by name. In reports, officers wrote, "When the Black Panthers arrive, we advance." White soldiers, who had never saluted a black man before, began treating Panthers like battlefield veterans. In one operation, infantry from the 26th Division refused to move without tank support. A Black Panther platoon leader, Lieutenant Samuel R. Johnson, stepped out of his tank and said, "You follow us. We'll take the first fire." They did. That moment rewired minds, not with lectures, not with protest signs, with courage. After Tillet was taken, an infantry captain approached Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, one of the finest tank commanders in the battalion. Exhausted, covered in mud and tank grease, Rivers expected criticism. Instead, the white captain offered his hand. "I'd fight with you anywhere." Rivers stared at him, not because he doubted the words, because for the first time in his life, a white officer treated him as an equal. That handshake was not just acknowledgement, it was history bending. For every mile they gained, they paid in blood. Tank commanders exposed themselves through open hatches to see the field. German anti-tank teams hid in ruins and forests. Roads were mined. The Black Panthers were fighting on enemy soil, surrounded by an army that had centuries of experience building defensive positions on European terrain. And yet, the Panthers never broke, never retreated, never stopped coming. They didn't have permission to fail. They only had a mission. Come out fighting. Snow drifted across the fields of northeastern France like ashes from a dying sky. The Panthers kept advancing, their tanks scarred, patched, and streaked with soot and ice. Exhaustion clung to their eyes, yet their pace never slowed. They had begun as a segregated experiment, a what-if that many commanders doubted. But by late 1944, other units had started to whisper something different. If the Black Panthers arrive, the line will hold. The battalion had become a legend the hard way. Mile by mile, town by town, fight by fight, their greatest test was about to come. Reuben Rivers had already earned a reputation as the battalion's fiercest tank commander. He didn't bark orders. He didn't give speeches. Rivers led by example, always being the first tank into the fight, always taking the most dangerous road, always volunteering for point position. His tank bore a white name scratched into the turret, Aunt Jemima. The paint wasn't meant as mockery. It was pride, home, identity. Every Black Panther tank crew decorated their hulls with symbols of where they came from, not where the army tried to place them. During an offensive near Guebling, Rivers' tank rolled forward into thick fog. Visibility, zero. Road conditions, mud and frozen debris. Somewhere ahead, the Germans waited. A flash. A thunderclap. A German 75mm anti-tank shell ripped into the Sherman. The tank rocked violently. Rivers was thrown forward against the hatch rim. Shrapnel tore into his leg, a wound deep enough to expose bone. Medics rushed to him. "You're done, Sergeant," the battalion doctor said. "You need to be evacuated, now." Rivers didn't even blink. "Patch me up," he said. Minutes later, he was back in the turret. His right leg was wrapped tightly. Blood pooled in his boot as he worked the radio. Panthers advancing. "I'm still leading." He could barely move his leg, but he pressed the tank forward, pushing his crew deeper into a German killing zone. The next day, as dawn scraped across the ruined village of Gwebling, Rivers spotted a German roadblock ahead, a fortified anti-tank nest with guns trained on the only road forward. He radioed headquarters, enemy position marked. "I'm going in." The reply was immediate. "Negative. Do not engage. Repeat, do not." Rivers cut off the transmission. "Aunt Jemima," he said to his crew. "Let's go." He didn't advance cautiously. He didn't wait for support. He charged. German guns fired, flashes lighting the morning fog. Rivers' tank fired back, again and again, eliminating one gun crew after another. His radio crackled with frantic voices. "Rivers, pull back!" "That's an order. You're exposed." Rivers didn't respond. He wasn't being heroic. He was buying time. His reckless push forced the Germans to reveal their hidden positions. Other Panther tanks swung into flanking angles. Infantry surged forward behind them. The line broke open. Then, a German 88mm round struck his tank. The explosion tore through the hull. Smoke poured out of the turret. For a moment, the battlefield froze. Then the hatch opened. Members of Rivers' crew crawled out, burned and bleeding, collapsing into the mud. Rivers never emerged. He had stayed in the tank, still firing, still commanding. When medics reached the wreck, they found him slumped in the turret, hands still gripping the cannon controls. He was 27. Word rippled through the battalion. No one cried. No one spoke. They mounted up and kept moving. Not because they didn't feel grief, because grief would have to wait until the war was won. Winter tightened its grip. The Battle of the Bulge erupted. The largest and deadliest battle the U.S. Army would fight in WS2. Entire divisions of American infantry were trapped. Patton needed to punch through and relieve them. The route chosen for breakthrough required tanks that could move fast, hit hard, and hold ground without breaking. Patton picked the Black Panthers. "Move out," the order read. "Break the German line." They drove day and night, barely eating, barely sleeping. They fought through villages with burned-out churches and frozen bodies lying in the streets. In some places, they fought so close that soldiers could hear the enemy breathing inside the next building. One Panther gunner described the experience. "We didn't fight for medals. We fought to prove we belonged here." On Christmas morning, they liberated a small Belgian town called Tillet. There was no tree, no celebration, just exhausted families emerging from cellars, crying at the sight of the white star painted on American tanks. And for many, shock when they saw the faces of the men inside. Black soldiers, American liberators. Children climbed onto the Shermans, wrapping their arms around the turret, refusing to let go. The Panthers didn't have time to stay. The war pulled them forward. By March 1945, the German army was collapsing. The Panthers crossed the Rhine River, the symbolic gateway into Nazi Germany. As they pushed deeper, resistance grew fiercer. Roadblocks, ambushes, fanatical SS units, the final defenders of Hitler's collapsing empire. In one assault, Panthers breached fortified German positions using a tactic almost no other tank unit attempted. They drove straight into the enemy guns. Not because they were reckless, because hesitation meant death. German machine gunners tried to hold intersections. Panthers crushed the barricades under their treads. Anti-tank teams fired Panzerfaust rockets from attics. Panthers blasted the houses apart with high-explosive shells. When infantry stalled, Panthers rotated turrets and fired point-blank into walls to clear a path. White soldiers, men raised in a segregated America, watched in disbelief. One of them later wrote, "I expected them to be good. I didn't expect them to be the best." The Panthers liberated 30 towns. They fought 183 days without relief, the longest continuous deployment of any tank unit in Europe. But the moment that changed them forever came near the end of the war. The battalion was rolling through a forested area in Austria when the radio operator spotted something strange. Civilians behind barbed wire, standing in ragged uniforms, staring through the trees at the tanks. They weren't soldiers. They weren't guards. They were prisoners. The Panthers had reached a subcamp of the Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp system. Skeletal figures stared at them, eyes wide, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. American tanks painted with a Black Panther. Some prisoners dropped to their knees. Others reached out, touching the tanks gently, as if unsure whether they were real. A crewman jumped off his Sherman and handed a chocolate bar to a boy who looked 11, though he was nearly 17. The boy burst into tears. Liberation had come in the form of men the U.S. Army had told were unfit. Men who had to fight 2 wars, one against the Nazi Army, one against American racism. When Germany finally surrendered, the Panthers expected to be celebrated. Instead, they returned to a segregated America. No parades, no medals, no recognition. When the battalion assembled for demobilization, a white officer told them, "You've done well. Now return to your old places." The Panthers didn't argue. They had already rewritten history where it mattered, on the battlefield. But some stories refused to stay buried. Years later, when military historians studied Patton's campaign, they realized something undeniable. Without the Black Panthers, the breakthrough in Europe would have failed. Reuben Rivers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, decades too late. Tank crews who once fought for a seat at the table became symbols of excellence. Politicians who once doubted them praised them. The Panthers had not just changed the war, they had changed the army, and they had changed America, not with protests, not with speeches, with courage. The Ardennes forest was a graveyard of shattered trees and frozen bodies. The wind sliced like broken glass. Visibility was nearly zero. Tanks crawled rather than drove, their engines straining against winter and war. This was the moment the Black Panthers were never supposed to reach, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last offensive, the last chance for Hitler to turn the war around. If the German attack succeeded, it would split the Allied armies in half, capture fuel depots, and perhaps force a negotiated peace. The front collapsed so violently that even Eisenhower admitted, "The situation is critical." American divisions retreated. Supply lines disintegrated. Thousands were surrounded. The U.S. Army needed a tank battalion that could move fast, fight constantly, and hold ground no matter the cost. There was only one on the map already positioned close to the breakthrough point. The 761st Tank Battalion, Segregated, unwanted at the start of the war. Now the most battle-tested tanks Patton had. At headquarters, Patton stood over a map, a riding crop in one hand, jaw tight. He slammed the crop against the location of the German breakthrough. "Send the Panthers." Some officers hesitated. One whispered, "Sir, they're colored." Patton didn't blink. "They're tankers, and they can fight." The decision was made. The Panthers rolled. Their advance toward the Bulge was brutal. Roads were sheet ice. Snow erased all tracks. German paratroopers operated behind American lines, ambushing convoys. Civilians fled, carrying what little they owned in broken carts and bags. As Panther tanks passed, villagers waved and prayed, some crying when they saw the American star painted on steel. They didn't care who was inside the tank. They only saw hope. The Panthers kept moving. Sometimes 20 hours a day, sometimes without sleep, sometimes without food. They rotated crews without stopping the tanks. One man would nap inside the turret while another took over the controls. The battalion commander issued only one hard rule. "We don't stop. Not for weather, not for fatigue, only for victory." On December 23rd, the Panthers reached the outskirts of Tillet, a key crossroads that the Germans needed to maintain their assault toward Bastogne. If Tillet held, the German advance would continue. If Tillet fell, the road to Bastogne would open. Allied infantry had already tried twice, and failed. Now it was the Panthers' turn. The town was a fortress. Machine gun nests in the hills. Anti-tank guns hidden in stone farmhouses. German tanks dug in behind the tree lines. Snow fell in sheets. The air burned with cold. Each breath felt like inhaling knives. Panther tanks crept forward. Inside Aunt Jemima, the lead tank, Staff Sergeant Rivers shifted his weight, wincing at the wound in his leg. The splint rubbing against his boot oozed blood that froze to his sock. He ignored it. He pressed forward. The first German shell hit the road in front of them, throwing snow into the air like an explosion of white ash. The radio crackled. "Contact front! Contact front!" Rivers keyed into the frequency. "Keep going." The second shell hit a Sherman to their right. The tank erupted in a sheet of flame, the heat melting snow around it, revealing charred earth and darker shapes. Rivers swung his turret toward the source. "Gunner, Target, enemy, 75 mm. The shell fired. German gun, destroyed. Rivers signaled the infantry behind him to advance. They followed the tanks like shadows, dodging gunfire between the armor and the tree lines. A white officer from the infantry looked at Rivers in disbelief and said to his men, "Stick close. These boys don't retreat." The Panthers pushed deeper into Tillet, block by block, house by house. Germans fired from church towers, from attics, from behind stone walls built centuries before America even existed. Each time, the Panthers blew holes straight through the buildings, letting infantry storm through rubble and smoke. The Germans expected hesitation. What they found was momentum. Panthers didn't freeze when they were fired on. They attacked harder. In tank combat, there is a moment where all training falls away, a moment where instinct takes over. The Germans saw something in these men they hadn't seen before. These tankers weren't fighting to win a battle. They were fighting to prove they deserved to exist. That kind of motivation cannot be broken. At noon, visibility dropped to 0. Fog smothered the battlefield. The Panthers found themselves in the worst possible position. They couldn't see their enemy, but the Germans could hear their engines. A shell hit the ground near Rivers' tank. Another hit behind them. They were being bracketed, artillery calculating distance with each shot. Most tank commanders would reverse. Rivers, advanced. Driver, forward. Let them shoot at our wake. Through fog and smoke, Rivers spotted an enemy gun crew loading another shell. He fired. The explosion shook the ground. German machine gunners tried flanking from the forests. Rivers turned the turret and lit the tree line with tracer rounds. The snow-glazed branches caught fire. In the middle of war, the forest glowed orange. The Panthers breached Tillet's center, but they were not done. The Germans had set up their strongest defenses near the crossroads, trenches, anti-tank guns, and overlapping firing lanes. If Panthers entered that kill zone, they were dead. Rivers didn't wait. He drove straight into it. His crew yelled for him to stop. He didn't. Machine gun bullets ricocheted off the turret like hail on sheet metal. Panzerfaust rockets streaked out of doorways, hitting the ground inches from the treads. Every tank commander knows there is a point where aggression becomes suicide. Rivers crossed that line, not recklessly, purposefully, to draw fire away from the other Panthers. The Germans took the bait. The turret of Aunt Jemima turned red from heat as it absorbed rounds. The tank almost disappeared beneath explosions and fire. Rivers shouted, "Gunner, load he! All of it!" The gunner lit up everything in front of them. Walls, bunkers, trenches. Each blast kicked up snow and debris. Panthers on the flanks advanced, clearing out resistance. Rivers didn't need to hear orders. He was the order. The battalion commander's voice erupted over the radio. "Rivers, pull back." "That's a direct command." Rivers ignored it. The commander shouted again, "Rivers, fall back!" Rivers keyed the radio. "I see them. I'm not leaving." Seconds later, a German 88mm gun, the most feared anti-tank weapon in the war, fired. The shell struck the left side of Rivers' tank. The explosion was deafening. Sherman lurched, fire erupted, the radio went quiet. Panthers on both sides saw the flaming wreck and froze, silent, stunned. Crew members crawled out of the tank, some engulfed in fire, collapsing into the snow. The medic sprinted forward. Rivers never moved, was still inside the turret, still holding the controls, still facing the enemy. The battalion surged forward with sudden fury. Tanks fired without hesitation, without fear, without anything left but rage. The Panthers became unstoppable. By nightfall, Tillet, the crossroads the Germans needed, fell. American infantry moved through the ruined streets, stepping over shattered stone. Panther tanks parked in the town center, engines finally shutting down after days of constant combat. A young white private from the infantry walked up to the tanks, removed his helmet, and said to the exhausted tankers, "We would never have taken Tillet without you." One of the Panthers looked at him and replied, "Now you know who we are." Rivers was dead, but the breakthrough was achieved. Tillet had fallen. The German offensive was blunted. The road to Bastogne opened. The Panthers had become the scalpel that cut open the German army at its most desperate moment. When Patton received the after-action report, he read the final line aloud. "Mission accomplished. No retreat." He closed the folder and whispered, "They earned their place." The snowstorm ended the same night Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers died. When dawn broke, the battlefield around Tillet was silent. Smoke curled from shattered barns and collapsed walls. Frozen German bodies lay scattered where the Panthers had smashed through their defenses. The ground was littered with shell casings and broken rifles. The survivors of the 761st stood next to their tanks, too numb to speak. River's tank remained where it had burned, blackened, still smoking slightly. The name Aunt Jemima was barely visible through soot and ice. No one touched it. No one spoke his name, because the mission wasn't done. Bastogne was still surrounded. German armor still pushed forward elsewhere. The Black Panthers had broken the line, but holding it required more than courage. It required endurance, the type that ignores pain and grief and demands only one more mile, one more hill, one more victory. Permission to mourn would come later, if it came at all. The next morning, engines roared to life. They rolled east. The German offensive was collapsing, but like every wounded predator, it was most dangerous in its final moments. The Panthers knew that the enemy in front of them wasn't the same army from 1941. These were soldiers fighting for survival. Men who had nothing left to lose. On the march toward Belgium's interior, the Panthers encountered the kind of landscape that war leaves behind. Abandoned churches with doors blown off their hinges. Frozen bodies of soldiers and civilians half buried in snow. Houses with roofs peeled open like tin cans. Villagers watched from shattered windows as the American tanks rolled through. When they saw black soldiers in the turrets, their expressions shifted from confusion to shock, then to gratitude. A mother waved as the tanks passed. Her daughter reached out and whispered, "Liberateurs, liberators." Some tankers blinked rapidly, not from the cold, but from the realization that in Europe, far from Jim Crow, people saw them not as inferiors, not as second-class citizens, but simply as Americans. Men worthy of being thanked, men worthy of being free. The battalion received new orders. Drive into German-held territory. Break all defensive positions. Do not stop. Patton didn't assign them light work. He gave them the hardest assignments. Everywhere the fight was thickest. The Panthers were sent villages that others couldn't take. The Panthers took. Roads that were too dangerous for white units. The Panthers drove. The men knew why. They were expendable. But instead of resenting that, they flipped it into fuel. If the army was going to use them, they were going to make damn sure the army never forgot them. By early spring, the Panthers reached Germany itself. Crossing the border felt surreal. They had gone from being doubted and mocked on American soil to becoming one of the most feared tank battalions on Hitler's. The roads were bombed beyond recognition, reduced to mud and cratered stone. German snipers hid in the bell tower of every village they passed. Panther tanks responded to every sniper the same way. One shell. One collapsed tower. The German defenders soon heard rumors. Avoid the tanks with the Black Panther painted on the side. They didn't know who was inside those tanks. They didn't know about segregation. They didn't know about racism. They didn't know these men had been denied entrance to the very army that now relied on them. All they knew was fear. At dawn on March 31st, 1945, the Panthers were pinned by German anti-tank fire on a heavily forested ridge. The road forward was narrow and mined. Any advance would mean death. A white infantry captain radioed the Panthers. "We can't move. We're pinned. We need tank support." Captain David Williams, one of the only black officers in the battalion, grabbed his radio handset. "Panthers. Form up." Soldiers from the infantry stared in disbelief. The Black Panthers' tanks rolled into the kill zone. First tank, hit. Disabled. Second tank, hit. Tracks blown off. The third tank advanced anyway. Bullets skipped off the glacis. Plates like sparks off steel. Panzerfaust rockets streaked through the air. The third tank fired into the hillside. One shell. Then another, until the German gun nest exploded. Infantry cheered. The Panthers didn't even slow down. They drove over the remains of the barricade and kept going. The white infantry captain stared at them, shaken. They weren't following orders, he whispered. They were leading the attack. The battalion continued east until the forests broke open into a flat clearing. They saw fences, barbed, wire watchtowers, and inside, thousands of starving prisoners staring, back silent, terrified, not understanding what American tanks were doing there. This was a sub-camp of the Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp system, a place of industrial death. The prisoners were skeletal, barely clothed, standing in mud and snow. A Panther tank rolled up to the gate. One of the prisoners stumbled forward, collapsing against the front armor, touching the hull as if to determine whether it was real or another hallucination. A black tanker jumped down and lifted the man to his feet. The man whispered, in German, "Amerikaner?" The tanker nodded. "Yes." "We're Americans." The prisoner looked at him for a long moment, tears welling, then whispered, "I never thought black men would save me." Behind the man, others began to fall to their knees. When the rest of the 761st arrived, they opened the gates. No speeches, no ceremony, just action. They shared their food, their own rations, and medical kits. Soldiers gave away coats. Others carried those too weak to walk. For a brief moment, the war stopped being about battles, objectives, and maps. It became about human beings saving human beings. When Germany surrendered weeks later, church bells across Europe rang. Soldiers fired rifles into the air. Cities filled with music, shouting, and drunken joy. But the Black Panthers didn't celebrate. They sat on their tanks outside the remains of a camp that should never have existed and stared at the horizon. For them, the war wasn't over, because the moment they stepped back onto American soil, they would return to a country that still segregated buses, restaurants, schools, and water fountains. Patton awarded them citations. Commanders called them heroes. Back home, they weren't allowed to sit at the same lunch counters as the soldiers they saved. One tanker later wrote, "We helped free Europe, but we weren't free ourselves." When the battalion was officially disbanded, the men stood at attention expecting commendation for their service. Instead, a white colonel told them, "You've done well. Now go back to your old places." No parade, no news coverage, no medals. Their legacy was erased, buried under prejudice. For decades, no one spoke their name. Not the army, not the press, not the history books. But truth does not stay buried. Years later, military historians reviewing Patton's campaign realized something shocking. The Panthers fought 183 days straight. No rest, no rotation, longest continuous combat of any tank battalion in WMW. Towns liberated 30+. Prisoners freed, thousands, medals earned, hundreds. They received the Presidential Unit Citation. The highest honor a battalion can earn. Too late, but deserved. The men didn't care about medals. They cared about memory, because memory is the only thing stronger than steel. Rivers was finally awarded the Medal of Honor, 51 years after his death. The medal citation ends with the words, "He refused evacuation." But that line misses the truth. He refused to be forgotten, and neither will the Panthers, because history isn't written by those who are allowed to fight. It's written by those who fight anyway. When the guns finally stopped, Europe was silent. The smell of cordite faded from the air. The shattered forest roads once patrolled by Panthers now lay littered with burned-out German armor. Entire towns, names no map ever bothered to highlight, had been reduced to rubble. But in those ruins, you could trace the path of the 761st Tank Battalion, a trail of shattered roadblocks, broken ambushes, and liberated villages. The Panthers didn't get a parade. They got another mission, and then another, and another. Because success didn't mean relief. It meant the army trusted them to do the impossible over and over again. While many white armored divisions rotated off the line after heavy losses, the 761st stayed in continuous combat for 183 straight days. The longest tank combat deployment of any U.S. armored battalion in World War II. No rest, no rotation, no breaks. Their tanks rattled, engines burning oil, tracks held together by field repairs and prayers. But when commanders needed someone to punch a hole through a fortified town, clear a crossroad, or rescue trapped infantry, one order became routine. Send in the Black Panthers. They liberated over 30 towns, including Steyr and Gunskirchen, fighting up to 20 hours a day. Sometimes they slept inside frozen tanks because the ground was too cold, or too dangerous, to lay on. They crossed rivers under fire, drove through minefields without flinching, and smashed German anti-tank defenses that stopped entire armored columns. Still, recognition never came. Communique reports left their name out. Newspapers didn't mention them. Even other American units couldn't believe black tankers were doing what white leadership claimed they weren't capable of. In war, they had earned respect. But in the country they served, equality still ended at the shoreline of Europe. When they reached the Austrian town of Gunskirchen, they stumbled upon something no amount of training could prepare a soldier for. A concentration camp. Prisoners were little more than skeletons. Some had used their last strength to crawl toward the sound of tank engines, assuming the Panthers were German armor returning. When they saw the white star stencil on the hulls, many collapsed in relief, hands shaking, whispering words the tank crews couldn't understand. Inside the camp, a Panther gunner removed his helmet and wept openly. A lifetime of discrimination hadn't hardened them against witnessing genocide with their own eyes. One tanker whispered to his crew, "If anyone ever doubts why we fought, remember this: their tanks had fought to liberate Europe, but that day they also liberated themselves from every lie about what they were capable of. They had proven, beyond debate, that courage does not have a color." The war ended with church bells, gun salutes, and celebrations that shook every major city in America. But not for the Black Panthers. They returned home quietly, stepping off troop ships with duffel bags slung over tired shoulders, expecting at least acknowledgement for what they had done. They didn't want statues. They didn't need medals. They just wanted to be seen as soldiers. Instead, many stepped into the same broken world they had left. Signs still hung on restaurants, whites only. Buses still required them to sit in the back. The same army they bled for still segregated its barracks. Some Panthers tried to wear their uniforms with pride through train stations, only to be told to remove them because black soldiers in uniform made white passengers uncomfortable. They had liberated Europe. They had crushed German armored divisions. They had stared into the abyss of a concentration camp. But in their own country, they were still fighting for the right to sit at a lunch counter. The official record was even worse. Reports miscredited their victories to other units. Combat logs listed their presence as attached support, even when they had led assaults. Major battles they turned from defeat to victory were written as successful engagements by U.S. forces, without naming them at all. History erased them, because acknowledging their success meant admitting the truth. Black Americans had not only fought and died for freedom, they had been essential to winning the war. In 1978, 33 years after W2'd, the U.S. Army finally awarded the 761st the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. In 1997, Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who gave his life refusing evacuation so his tank could keep fighting, was finally awarded the Medal of Honor. His sister accepted it. He never lived to wear it. During the ceremony, President Bill Clinton said, "No African American has ever been awarded the Medal of Honor for World War II until now." Today, America corrects that mistake. Not a tribute, a correction, because history had been wrong. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is remembered as one of the fiercest armored units the U.S. ever fielded. Their legacy is studied at West Point. Their motto, "Come out fighting," still echoes through Army armor schools. But their real legacy lives not in medals, but in every soldier who serves without limitation because of their color. They didn't just break through German lines. They broke through America's. In war, courage is easy to see. It's the flash of a tank gun, the roar of engines pushing through mud, the moment when a soldier chooses to move forward instead of run. But the courage of the 761st Tank Battalion was different. It began long before they saw combat. Long before Germany. Long before the war. Their courage began at home, in a country that told them they were second class, unwanted, unproven. They didn't fight only an enemy across the ocean. They fought an enemy woven into the fabric of the society they defended. Every time they climbed into a steel turret, they carried two battles, one against the Germans, one against doubt. When their tanks rolled across Europe, they didn't just break enemy lines, they shattered the limits placed on them by their own country. History often remembers the war as victories and losses, generals and battlefields, but history is wrong. Wars are won by ordinary people who do extraordinary things when no one is watching. The Black Panthers never asked for equality to be given to them. They earned it. In the mud of France, in the snow of the Ardennes, in the ashes of liberated camps. And when the world tried to forget them, their legacy refused to fade. Today, their story lives on, because inequality never survives the truth. The truth is written in steel and sacrifice. The truth is written in towns they freed. The truth is this: America did not give them a place in history. They took it, and in doing so, they proved that freedom isn't protected by the privileged, but by those who fight hardest to earn it.